You heard from two vendors. Consulting vendor, who hopefully scared you. Was anyone scared? Okay, there's some scared people there, yeah. And a system vendor. And in this session you'll hear from another system vendor. Maybe some of you have heard of IBM. It's a small subsidiary of GBM. Then you're going to hear from a user, someone who actually has to protect real infrastructure for large retail customers. So as we go through the next few hours, we're going to be hearing more from people like you who have to protect an infrastructure, as opposed to somebody selling something to you to protect an infrastructure. Our next speaker is David Drucker. David is, it's been translated, Arquitecto de Soluciones y Seguridad Senior. Well, so senior something or other at IBM. David has a long history in helping organizations build protection for their infrastructures, and he's going to tell us how to do that in a world that's changing very rapidly, especially with all of the mobile solutions and cloud-based solutions and the advanced threats that you heard about from Greg Rattray at the beginning of the day. So David.
Buenos dias. Can you hear me okay? Apparently. All right. So this is going to be take up, I think I'll talk about some of the same things that Luis talked about, and certainly touch on some of the same things that Greg talked about. But what we're really going to do is get a good understanding of all of the security things you need to be thinking about. So I'm going to cover a lot of material in a certain way, but I hope you get something out of it. So I'm really going to talk about business today, which is to say that's my focus. Certainly we're going to talk about security for business, but I'm not interested in the abstract security. I'm interested in security for businesses, government organizations, other large and medium and small organizations. But the focus is on usable techniques that you can use to secure your enterprises, because that's what you care about, not the theory of security, but the practice of security. Maybe this mic should be disabled. That might fix a little bit. Okay, let's quickly look at the common business functions. You have manufacturing or some other type of production. Now, that's maybe information is what you produce or run a hotel, but there's some core focus that the business does. Sales and distribution, both retail and through channels. Everyone does this. Marketing, which might include product management, management administration, and then finance, accounting, legal, HR, and of course information technology itself, IT, information technology. So the business problem is, how do you secure all of these different environments? And the other question you need to ask is, how much security? So this is really a big question. All of this costs a lot of money. I listened to Luis talk about all these wonderful technologies that Cisco has for securing mobile phones. And that's going to cost a lot of money. You've got to secure layer 1, layer 2, all these other layers, multiple encryption. I think those are all important, but you need to evaluate what your requirements are. So there's really at least two ways to look at this. One is how critical is security to your business? Or actually, how critical is technology to your business? So if your business focuses on some competitive differentiator that is technology, then you have a higher value to that technology. And that's what I think you really need to, you're going to be spending money on security. Let me give you an example. A bank, primarily, what do they sell? Well, it's banking, but that's really a form these days of information technology. So financial institutions, I have many customers who are large financial institutions, multinational, and they spend a tremendous amount of effort trying to secure their systems. As Greg mentioned earlier, they are under constant attack. They have, that's the other problem, is they're also under a lot of attack. But there's other businesses that may use technology just as much. So for instance, a government of Costa Rica or the government of San Jose, you probably have websites, you have voting, you have other information resources, these need to be protected. And then even a business like tourism or a hotel, they all have websites, so their selling is through the website. And to the extent that that is an important feature, then they need to secure that as well. But another question is, are some businesses targeted more? And I think that there is some evidence that financial institutions are being targeted more because of the valuable information. Governments, but this data, which is collected by a part of IBM called the X-Force, which studies worldwide security threats. They publish an annual report. I have a link to it at the back of the slide set. You're welcome to download your own copy. The trends are really, they're not trends. So, for instance, this is one type of attack, phishing or scams. 2 or 3 years ago, the financial institutions were being hit hard. Earlier this year, the NGOs became under the greatest attack, or last year. But on average, it really isn't. There isn't any focus. What we see is certainly there are organizations who are targeting, who are not targeting. They're attacking everybody. They do target individuals for, as Greg said, for specific projects, specific people. But every company is susceptible to attacks. So I'm not sure how that drives your security. It means that everyone has to do a certain amount, but if you have high value in your assets, then you may have more. Okay, so I'm going to begin talking then about how you secure this. IBM's approach is that we have this, what we call a security framework. So this is based upon COBIT standards and some other standards, the Open Group. OMG may have something in this area. I'm not actually sure. I should know. And I have some links to the relevant sources at the back of my deck. So this describes, let me just tell you what this is. The 4 vertical pillars, people, data, applications, and infrastructure, those are really technology domains or security domains. This is what you need to protect. So all of the business functions that I talked about earlier, they all have some element of these. Most business functions use all of these things. So, and I'm going to, on the balance of the presentation today, I'll be drilling down into these things in some depth. Across the top, there's this thing called security, intelligence, and analytics. One clarification, what does the word intelligence mean in this context? We're really talking about intelligence in the sense that Greg would talk about it. It's getting insight from data. So it's not about being smarter, that's good too, but it's about intelligence and analyzing it. So what are we analyzing? And as you'll see in some detail, we need to analyze the data from these other security domains, from these other protection domains. We also have to analyze data from everywhere in your IT infrastructure. So all of those things are required. At the top, there's governance, risk, and compliance. I think David from State Street is going to talk about that in more detail. I really won't touch upon it too much here, but that's a important part of the puzzle as well. And then underneath all of this, there's the notion of advanced security and threat research, which your vendors of your security products presumably are doing that for you. But large organizations of the caliber of State Street or large telecoms do their own study of security trends. Or they hire specialist firms like some of the other people represented on the stage today to do this analysis for them. So we think that's important too. I'm going to just take up my phone and put on my timer here so I have some idea of what we're going to do. Also, I should mention that the set of slides that may be printed for you will differ slightly from mine, but the electronic version of what I'm presenting today will be available later, and you can download that. So I would recommend that. I made a few changes. Okay. Let's talk about the infrastructure piece of this. So I'm going to work from the bottom up to some extent. So what is infrastructure? At a minimum, it's your network. So this includes things like your routers, your firewalls, also the switches and the wires. In the case of mobile, which we'll talk about a little later, it's that Wi-Fi network that Luis talked about. Also, your servers. These days, servers may be appliances. They may be, that is to say, purchased a computer that is specialized for some function, which we call an appliance. Or it could be conventional, just you install Windows or Linux or Unix, and then you put software on top of that. And then your endpoints, which again we're going to talk in some detail about all the kinds of endpoints, but these are the client devices. So laptops, my laptop is a client. Mobile, we'll talk about that in a bit. So how do you secure this infrastructure? Well, there's some standard techniques that I just want to make sure that you're aware of. So number one, there's firewall. You need to have firewalls at your perimeter and probably firewalls separating different sections of your network. But as is abundantly clear, and every other speaker's made reference to this, firewalls are necessary but not sufficient. The same, by the way, and I'm not going to talk about this in much detail, much like antivirus software on your computer, it's necessary but not sufficient. The reason firewalls are not sufficient is because there's so many points of entry, and there's so many ways that the attackers can get in at different layers and through different pathways. And so you do need to have firewalls, but don't trust them too much. A related thing like that is load balancing. Load balancers primarily are effective in keeping your infrastructure up against distributed denial of service attacks. So the banks that are being attacked, the way they stay up is they have global load balancers in multiple locations. They may enlist specialist firms like Akamai to assist them as well. But this balances the load, enables them to withstand attacks while they're figuring out what to do about it. And then we get into some more conventional network security products, intrusion prevention systems, IPS, this is often called. And for the most part, I'm not going to mention IBM's products. Obviously, IBM plays in many of these markets. We don't make all of these things, but in this case, this is something that we do make. And so there are roughly two types. There's network intrusion prevention systems and endpoint intrusion prevention systems. Both of these do the same thing. They do deep packet inspection of the actual traffic traversing the network, look at what's in those packets, and try and decide if that is an attack. And we have various proprietary algorithms for determining that, but that's what they do. Originally, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, these were called intrusion detection systems because they could only monitor the attacks. Now we can put them in full bandwidth mode. You can actually examine all the data at full wire speed, even up into the multi-gigabit range, and you can block attacks too. And we find most of our customers are using that blocking to some extent. They don't want to even let those attacks into their network. And then the last part about infrastructure management is to manage your endpoints. So endpoints, again, are the things at the top. Actually, the endpoints include servers in this case. You want to have, you certainly already have probably a variety of software that may inventory what's on each computer, do patch management, but these things have security implications. And we think it's very important that you use your endpoint management technologies as a security device. Because that's, for instance, if somebody compromises a PC, puts on a rootkit, something like that, your endpoint manager should be the first source of detection because it actually looks at the files. It can evaluate what's trusted and what's not trusted on that computer and report back to you, and even erase or patch it. Okay. Next thing I'm going to talk about is people. So people is several groups. Your employees, number one, contractors and partners. These are companies that you work with in some fashion. Your customers is the other really big group. For some companies, customers are a huge thing. For telecoms, for instance, their customers are some type of, they use their electronic infrastructure. That's one of the biggest avenues to both defend against and protect. And finally, for some companies that have business relationships with other companies, you're working with the customers of their parties, of the partners. This certainly, in the case of a cloud service provider or something like that, hybrid cloud, which I'll talk about a little later, there may be plenty of situations where your customers have your partners have their own customers, and you need to defend against them as well as protect them. Okay, the security for people is a big area. This is in general called identity and access management. That's the common term for this. some of these things really don't flow from security. They came from business efficiency. Things like single sign-on. The original source for that was to lower your costs. Why make somebody log in 10 times to different applications? Let them log in once. And so that's part of this. But there are security implications as well. In particular, though, looking at the top of my chart, identity management, managing the notion of roles, of user provisioning, governance, also entitlements of what users can do, and then something that is increasingly important is the notion of privileged identity management, managing those people, those systems administrators, like a famous one who worked for an American security company, who they want to make sure that they have the access that they have to your computers is closely monitored. And there are a variety of vendors who make solutions in all of these areas, and so these are things you should evaluate. AAA is a common term for authentication, authorization, and auditing. Many times your single sign-on infrastructure will be doing that authorization and auditing. Identity federation, this involves when you work with partners, there may be multiple login names and usernames, and this is some type of machinery that brokers this. There's a number of standards on the internet, SAML, OpenID, and OAuth, and some others that contribute to this area, make it possible across vendors, for instance. So I have a little bit more to say about that when I come back to mobile, but let's just go on. The next one is applications. So this may or may not apply to all of the participants today. If you write your own applications, including your own web pages, how secure are they? This is one of the biggest problems many companies have, is securing the applications that they write themselves, or even get from third parties, for that matter. So we're really talking about software here. And the key thing to do from a security point of view, one, discover the applications. So I worked with a very large telecommunications company, and they recently talked to us, and they said, I know that we have thousands of applications, but every day some department I've never heard of, this is a company that's roughly the size of IBM, with more than 400,000 employees. Some department has created a new application, deployed it on the internet, and we don't even know about it. So that's clearly a security problem. So they wanted us to talk to them about software that would detect this application. So that's number one. Second is knowing that you have an application, is it secure? Is it susceptible to attacks? So IBM and many other companies have software that will scan your applications, and there's two branches to this. There's scanning running applications, which is called dynamic testing, has many other names. It could be also called black box testing. It's black box because you don't know what's in there. You send a series of probes at the running application and find out how it responds. And this is very similar to what hackers do. They send probes into your software and try and find out, is this software susceptible to some attack? And if it is, you want to fix it, of course, but maybe it's third party. Maybe you bought it from some other company. Then you at least need to know about it. You need to protect it some other way, with an intrusion prevention system or some other technique. So this is why, in some sense, this is the theme of my talk. You need to have multiple ways of securing your IT, and you seem to look at different levels. In any event, so you want to scan the applications while running. If you actually are writing code, then you also should do what's called static or white box testing. Also called scanning of source code is what you're doing. And this is a little more complicated, but it's really important. One thing that I talk to customers and they say, I've got all these great young programmers. They came right out of college, these technical schools. They know all the latest languages. They can whip up these Web 2.0 and mobile apps, but they know nothing about security. And they're not even being told to code securely in many cases. And people who know all of that plus security are hard to find and are expensive. So what we find most customers are doing, they're hiring a few people of that caliber, either outside contractors or employees, and then giving them tools that do this advanced deep scanning of the source code. And so combined with that, you can produce environments that are robust. And again, with the level of attacks we're facing today, then you need to have this level of depth. Okay. and the last thing was, I won't talk too much about it, runtime enforcement of entitlements. If you have entitlements in your software, you should really have policies that control how they're accessed. And there are some sophisticated technologies that do this, but the idea in general is you should have security policies that control what people do, not just let the programmer decide, well, if the person is a manager, then they get this access. Well, you need those rules, but they should be carefully managed. Let's talk about the data level. So data is below the applications in most cases, although not always. But if you talk about structured data, like relational databases, how do you secure those? A lot of people would say, well, the application's in front of the database. No one can get to the database without, logging on to the app. Well, that's mostly true, but not entirely. And what happens if, there's a couple of things. One, what happens if the application security fails? This can and will happen. People outwit these things, and especially if the application has some weakness, like a vulnerability to a SQL injection attack, then they'll get access to the database. Also, if you have systems administrators, database admins, those people have access to your databases. They have to have access to your databases to do their job. They have to tune the database, they have to back it up. How do you keep them from doing things they shouldn't? Like, for instance, viewing sensitive data, looking at personal identifiable information, looking at corporate bank statements, or even worse, making changes. So suppose you have a banking application. A database administrator can go in, manipulate the tables, and transfer money from some account into his or her account. That wouldn't be very good. And so there's a whole set of technologies that discover databases, work in the area of classifying its vulnerability, monitoring the activity. That was what I just talked about. If your DBA goes in and does a transaction that she or he is not supposed to, you can have an activity monitor. And there is some software from IBM and others that will even block activity based upon policy. You could say DBA is allowed to back up this table, but not to view this table. And it can't be defeated because it's not at the layer of the database. It lives at a deeper level in a trusted computing environment. And also masking of sensitive data, encryption. There's a variety of things there. Okay. On top of all of those things, the four pillars of people, data, applications, and infrastructure, you need to gather insights. So this is where, this is possibly the newest thing. And this is why I named this talk Unified Security. Another term we often use in IBM is integrated. I think unified is a Cisco term. Everyone's got their buzzwords. But so the point here is you need to gather the information from all the security infrastructure and analyze it. And so from that you get insight about normal operations, which is very important because to detect those advanced persistent threats that we've been talking about, you need to know what's normal, and then you have to. Then you can have a chance of spotting what's abnormal. You can see when somebody logs in, say from some system, say that where the IP address is a system in Brazil, and then maybe an hour later they seem to be in North America. And how did this happen? Is this some kind of breach, or you need to have the data that shows that, and then you need to have something that correlates that. Maybe they're using multiple identities from the same computer. What's going on there? So there is a segment of software or security software called security intelligence. Among the types of systems in there are security information and event management systems. Increasingly, these systems also are doing deep data analytics on huge data sets. So this is the big data solution to security. Big data is often thought of as a security problem, and it is, because all of this data creates tremendous amounts of things that need to be monitored. But at the same time, if we can analyze all that data with very sophisticated algorithms, we can find things that maybe we wouldn't see otherwise. Also, just more standard things like analyzing your network flows. Another thing that is important to do is to scan your servers for vulnerabilities. This is closely related to something I talked about earlier, which is scanning for applications and scanning for databases. Now we're just scanning for open ports. We're trying to figure out which ports are unprotected, which ports have things we don't even know about. It's not an application, it's not a database. Well, if it's listening, it's doing something. So we need to find out what it is, and that's a key thing. In addition to scanning, we need to collect that data, and then maybe correlate that with other things. Maybe there's a network flow that goes from someplace into that unknown port. That might provide you evidence about what's going on. Ultimately, we need to correlate all of this data. That's how we gain the intelligence. And another part of that is just then analyzing, detecting the anomalies. What's different, finding those and protecting those against those. Okay, let's see my time here. Okay, so all of this means that there are, again, looking at this from a different way, there are multiple attack paths through your environment. So there's interrelated technology and unpredictable attack, leads to unpredictable attack paths. So for instance, maybe you have an outsourcer who is compromised, and they attack your database. And from that, they get access to your system application, and from there, maybe to PCs. This is the kind of stuff that can't be predicted. It's too complicated now. That's the thing. Even in a small company, you've got mobile devices, you've got servers, you've got things that you're getting from cloud providers. How do you understand where all this stuff's going? So this is just really the nature of the problem. The solution, as we said, is to collect data from all of these places and pipe it up. But this is just an illustration of that problem. I'm going to kind of skip over this one. This one I've kind of said already. We analyze the security from a variety of points of view. We feed that data into security intelligence server. I want to point out that also you have other sources of data as well. So your applications, possibly unstructured data. There's a lot of other sources of data. We think that you should try and analyze as much of it as is possible to gain a deep understanding. This is not necessarily that easy. The technology to do this is just becoming available, and it's only the largest companies are analyzing all their data. But you should look into it and try and understand what you need to analyze and to protect yourself. That's what every company should do. In fact, that leads me to this next slide, which is this analysis of security maturity. So this is another way to look at what you have versus what you need. So at the beginning I said, how much security do you need? And I said you should analyze it partially based upon how valuable your technology is, how sophisticated your IT operation is, to some extent how big a company you are. But then the question is, what am I doing? What do I need to do? Well, most companies have some type of directory, Active Directory or something like that. Virtually everyone has logins to their database. A lot of companies use application scan. So these are things we call basic. The next level up is to add additional things. So for instance, just to talk about one of them, in the user provisioning area or the people area, you want to have some type of user provisioning or identity management application. You want to have access management and strong authentication. Taking a little higher, you should bring in governance, this kind of stuff that David from State Street will talk about. You should perhaps have a fine-grained entitlements. Now, this is really just an example. Every company needs to do their own analysis, and you can engage firms like IBM or JBM or other vendors to do this for you. I think it's very important, though, to get some sense of how mature is your current implementations, where do you need to take them to get to where you want to go. We would say, at least over the long run, you want to be at this level of optimized, which is just our term for saying you're doing everything you reasonably can do to be secure. So this is a tool for understanding what you need to do. Okay, I'm going to talk the remainder of the talk. And about how much longer do I have, Richard? 20 minutes? 25? 10. Good. That's even better. I don't want to talk for that long. So, what's new? Advanced threats are not really new, but they're cloud computing, mobile computing, also regulation and compliance. I'm going to focus on cloud and mobile. What we're going to do is do these introduce new requirements? Well, I'm going to look back at the same diagrams that we had, but I'm going to show you just the beginnings, really, anyway, of what cloud and mobile add. And for instance, Luis talked about this in even more detail for mobile, but this is our analysis of how it fits into that framework. So if you add cloud and mobile to infrastructure, what more do you need to do? Well, the main thing you need to do is start protecting virtualized environments. So if you're using, say, private clouds, or built with something like VMware, you need to make sure that it itself is secure. And there are a variety of products that make sure that your hypervisor itself has not been compromised. In the area of mobile, you want to look at mobile connection security. And again, there are a variety of techniques. One approach that sort of answers a question that was raised was how do you be sure that someone who has their own device, that something bad they've installed on it doesn't get connected to your network? One way IBM solves this for my own personal iPhone is I have restricted access to IBM's network. I don't have full access. I get email, I get social collaboration tools, I get a few other things. So I have a network connection to IBM, but they mediate it just to a limited subset of what I can get with my computer. On my computer, I can go to the full inside. I can get to anything, but not so with my phone. And so that's a partial solution. Another area is mobile device management. So this is where you put some type of agent on the device. Now, you can't do this for your customers' mobile phones, and so that doesn't solve this problem. But for your employees' phones, even when it's BYOD, you can put some type of monitoring agent, and IBM does that. So I had to sign an agreement. It doesn't seem to affect my phone at all, but it does ensure, for instance, that I have a strong 8-character password. So on my phone, it's pretty annoying, but every 15 minutes, I have to, and that's why I keep touching it here to make sure it doesn't go to sleep, I have to walk up to it and put in an 8-character password with numbers so that it stays secure. And that can be monitored by the mobile device management software. Okay, how about people? This is actually one of the most interesting areas when you talk about cloud and mobile. One thing in particular with mobile is how do you know, for instance, that we know, for instance, if I log on to an application, if I put in a password in, well, we know it's me. But how do we know whose phone this is? I mean, if this phone IBM has Endpoint Manager on, we know this phone's not compromised. But suppose I put the same email app on Richard's phone. Well, I don't know anything about Richard's phone. And so what you need to do is register the application and the phone. And this is one use of what's called context-based authentication and authorization. As device registration actually goes back under infrastructure. But actually, I'm mixing a couple of metaphors here. You want to register the phone, and then you also want to evaluate where the phone is being used from. So that's the other thing. So is the phone being used from another country? Is it being used in the middle of the night? You can even collect biometrics from the phone, like fingerprints, conceivably pictures and other things. These things can all be used by your authentication and authorization server to decide if someone should get access to your corporate data. So this is actually a very interesting area of research. IBM and some others have some interesting products in this area that you might want to evaluate. And here's on this one is where the mobile app registration, so I confused where I put it. In the area of applications, that's where mobile, you need to do the device registration, which I was just talking about. But also, it adds some additional things as app scanning, secure containers. In the case of cloud computing, it adds, cloud security is not that much different, I would maintain, from standard security. When you're talking about private clouds, when you're talking about public clouds where you're getting software as a service from a third-party vendor, it becomes a little more complicated. Jerry from Demandware will talk about that area. But in the area of cloud apps, we certainly want to understand what's there, and so we need software that will find applications in clouds. It might be a little different than finding standard applications. And then in the area of data, we want to do activity monitoring of databases in clouds. It might be a little different, and you also want to make sure that you have a secure mobile data design. The most common pattern for mobile data design is to not put the data on the phone at all. So that's not entirely possible, but if you have an application where the user gets access, but none of the data is downloaded into the phone, then when the phone gets lost or stolen, you haven't lost anything. As long as you can keep them from logging in. And if the device is registered, or you can find out that it was lost through endpoint management, which also is possible, you can disable that phone and protect your data. And then finally, in the area of security, intelligence, and analytics with cloud and mobile, the biggest problem there is with clouds, private cloud environments, you may have now, instead of one application server that you know about, you might have 100 that spring into existence because you have some type of elastic compute environment. Amazon uses this term, the notion of elasticity, but it applies to all clouds. And then when demand lows, after Christmas, you don't need as many servers, you have less servers. Well, how do you secure something when it wasn't there 5 minutes ago, and then tomorrow it's gone again? So you need some type of technology that detects these things, and the way to do it essentially is build some security agents into each cloud instance, so when they spring into existence, they can communicate their existence to your central servers, and then you can run security on them. So that's the main area I want to talk about there. Okay, that's really all I have. I have some other slides in the electronic version, which you're free to look at, including some things that are related to demonstrations I do in this area. But this is just a set of links. They are mostly IBM links, but they're not all product specific. Many of them are general topics. You might want to look at these and get some ideas. And I'd be happy to take any questions. If there's no questions, okay. They may have killed that for you. Well, thank you. Thank you then.
Hold on.
Some questions?
¿Hay preguntas? I have a question, David.
Yes, Roberto.
Typically, the approach to security, both physical and cybersecurity, is you figure out what the risks are and then you take measures to defend against them. Does this security intelligence and analytics, do they provide a way to automatically detect risks?
Some products do. Automatically is a big stretch. But what you can write are rules based on your policies that can say, look at your normals and say, we know that people log in from 9 to 5 every day from the subset. If something is different, then that becomes an anomaly. So I'm saying that it's not totally automatic, but I think it can be programmed in fairly easily. All right. Thank you very much.